Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on how to conduct a computer security review. My name is Mike Tabor, and I'll be your host for today. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to go through essentially 8 topics around how to conduct a security review. So I'll start off by telling you a little bit about Moon River, who I am, what we do, and then we're going to dive right into some of the different use cases for doing a security review. We're going to talk about some of the security challenges associated with doing a security review, and then essentially talk about where do I start with this, because that's one of the big questions about doing a security review. How do you get started? What sorts of things do you look at? And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the best practices, how to create your own security policy, and from there we're going to go into implementation. So we'll talk about how to implement something like this in your environment, and then we'll talk about what the next steps are beyond this. So if you have any questions at any time, feel free to type into the chat roll window. I am monitoring that for any questions that people have. And so with that, let's get started. So just to tell you briefly about Moon River Software, about who I am, I used to work for a company called Pedestal Software that was acquired by Altiris Corporation back in 2005 for about $75 million. And at the time, I was the 4th engineer that was hired at the company, helped assist with all of the implementation of the security policies across all the various platforms that we supported. So that included Windows, AIX, HPUX, Solaris, Linux, etc. So pretty much anything that the product supported, I helped implement the security policies on those. And once I struck out on my own, I did a lot of security consulting in the audit and compliance space for mostly extremely large companies. So United Health Group, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, Merck, Liberty Mutual, NASDAQ, Federal Reserve Bank, Department of Defense, etc. There's a list of them there if you're really interested in taking a look at them. But essentially, through working with all of these customers, what I realized was that there was a big gap in the market because most of the companies were really concentrating on much larger environments, and the small companies that, under 500 employees, under 1,000 employees, were really left kind of to fend for themselves. There wasn't really anything out there. So from that, I essentially developed a product called Audit Shark that helped people to assess their environments and essentially allow them to identify deviations or deficiencies in their environment with regards to their security posture. And my goal with all of that was essentially to help people spend less time and money on security and more time working on their business. So with that said, let's talk about some of the different use cases for security reviews. Why are security reviews important? And there's a lot of different reasons why a security review is important. The first one is that the first use case for this is if you've inherited a bunch of computers and you have no idea how they're configured. Anyone who's stepped into a new role in a department, or you've taken a new job at a company, you have no idea how those servers are configured. The second use case is if somebody leaves the company, whether it's voluntarily or involuntarily. Sometimes they're a combination of two. So you ask somebody to resign because they did something that you don't necessarily want your customers to find out. I have seen that happen, but you don't necessarily know how those machines were left, and you have to go in and you have to make sure that there's no back doors that are left open for that person to come back in. And it's not necessarily malicious either. Sometimes it's just a USB key was lost that had a bunch of usernames and passwords on it. So you have to go in and you have to say, okay, well, is there anything that happened on these machines, or is it likely that anything will happen on these computers that I'm not going to be, I don't want to be responsible for those things. I want to make sure that, whoever is out there is locked out of those machines. Third scenario is you've brought more servers online, management has become difficult. Anyone who gets past the point of managing 2 or 3 or 4 servers starts to realize what a burden it is to actually monitor all those servers and make sure that they are locked down in a manner that's appropriate for the environment and for the usage or for the uses things that they're being used for. And you just want to make sure that they're up more often than not. Another use case, you don't know what software is installed anymore. Maybe these servers have been around for a while. Maybe the responsibilities for them have taken kind of a back seat because the people who've been responsible for them have kind of shifted their responsibilities. There's also the fact that over time, things just change. You aren't necessarily always aware of things that are changing. Patches, installed software, automatic updates, all of these things can introduce problems into your machines, or changes that you're not necessarily aware of. A historical known case for this is Microsoft updates. When they go in, they will very frequently change the permissions on many of the different file systems such that those patches will run and execute properly, so that they will be applied to the machine. Most people don't realize that historically Microsoft has been very bad about that, and they will just arbitrarily change permissions on different directories in the file system, and then they won't change them back. So those are, if you've changed them at all to meet your own requirements, sometimes Microsoft will change those and they won't tell you about it. So those are just some of the different use case scenarios. Another one that I like to point out is you just want to be sure. How do you know that a system is configured properly unless you actually go look at the server? I can't count the number of times that I've been out doing consulting and I've asked somebody, hey, is this installed in such and such a way? Oh, yes, it absolutely is. And I was like, can you please go check it? I just want to be sure so that I don't spend the next 8 hours doing something that isn't going to work because it isn't configured this way. And somebody goes and checks it, and oh, lo and behold, that machine is actually misconfigured. It's not configured according to what their standards are. So it's very common for these types of things to come up. And the question at the end of the day is, why are you going to do these security reviews? And some of these different use cases address that, but what's the ROI on it? Why, what is the benefit to the company? What is the benefit to you? What's the benefit to the servers of doing a security review? And the bottom line is this: it's really no different than doing any sort of routine system maintenance on anything. So for example, you take your car to the shop and you get the oil changed, and you do that on a regular basis because it's essentially required for the machine to keep running. Well, with a security review, it's kind of the same thing. What's the cost to the business if a system goes down for an extended period of time? If a machine gets hacked, for example, or exploited for whatever reason, because there were vulnerabilities that somebody came in and took advantage of, then that machine has to go down for an extended period of time. And you can't necessarily go to a backup because that backup may be compromised as well. There's this idea in the security world that has actually come much more to the forefront, that there are what are called long dwell hackers, where once they get in, they will stay there and they will essentially poke around a system for an extended period of time before they start to do anything malicious, because they want to learn what data is there and how they can best use that data. It's not just about bringing a server down. It's about how can I suck data out of that machine and use that for other purposes, and what is available to me. Well, they may very well have been there for weeks, months, or even years before you find out that they're there. And going to a backup at that point is not easy to do because you don't necessarily know when they first got there, so you don't know which backup to go to. And even if you do know which one to go to, it's not always easy to do that. It could take you weeks just to get the data to it, and then there's always data that you're going to have to restore from a backup, and it's very difficult to be sure that a compromised server that you're restoring from backup doesn't also have the same vulnerabilities that allowed them to get in the first place. So typically you have to rebuild an entire server if it's been compromised. So that's really what a lot of this boils down to, is making sure that you're doing these things for the right reasons. So let's talk about some of the security challenges that are associated with this type of thing. When you are going out to do a security review, there are 6 core challenges that most people have. And the first one is knowledge. What do I even do? Where do I start? And is this particular line item or this configuration item important for me to even look at? And unless you're embedded into the security industry and you're doing a lot of security work, it can be very difficult to look at something and just make a judgment call about whether a particular line item on a best practices policy is even important to look at. You don't necessarily know. The second one is the access rights that people have, and this is especially true in smaller companies. But when you have a small company that's less than, say, 50 employees, they typically give full access to most of the systems. And as that company grows, they start pulling that access back so that they can essentially follow what's called the least privileges principle, where you give people the least amount of privileges that they need in order to do their job. And you do that not necessarily because you want to restrict them, but because you want to make sure that if somebody accesses their account, they don't have the privileges to do widespread devastation on the machine. So that's another challenge, is not everybody knows what rights should be available to different people. The third reason is mistakes. people make mistakes. So that's just a fact of life. It's a fact of the world. The people make mistakes, and you don't necessarily know the full impact of a change that you're making on a server until after you've made that change or you've done the research to figure out what is going on there. So it's very, very common for people to go onto a server where the application is broken for whatever reason. You make 5 or 10 changes to it, and then you say, okay, well, is anything in here, did anything in here introduce a security vulnerability, or is, any of those changes that were done, do they do something to the machine that it puts it in a worse security posture? And a lot of times, unless you do the research on it, you don't necessarily know. The fourth thing is a lack of security tools. When you're not typically in the security industry, or even if you are, there's just so many tools out there that you don't know where to start. A lot of these tools are complicated to use, they're difficult to understand, and sometimes training is just difficult to get, not just because of the cost of the training, but because of the time required to get that training. Sometimes training isn't offered more than once a quarter, and so the software sits on the shelf for a long period of time, and you're not able to use it, and that entire time that you're not able to use it, you're not getting value out of it or locking down your machines. So essentially you have a larger window for vulnerabilities or security breaches to occur in your environment. And then there's also a lack of communication, especially when you get into larger environments where the IT team is not necessarily involved in every business decision. So if the sales team or the marketing team just decides, hey, we're going to go out and we're going to start using Dropbox for Business because we need a way to start syncing files back and forth. Well, depending on what data they're putting in there, that could be a huge problem because you don't know whether or not the data is encrypted. You don't know whether it's personal information, credit card numbers, social security numbers, personal health information from some of your customers. All of that stuff is generally regulated information, and it should not be going into something like Dropbox, because Dropbox is secure, but it's not necessarily private. The people at Dropbox have the ability to go into those files and take a look at them. Now, according to their policies, they may, they say that they will not do that, but that's not to say that they can't. And the law is not necessarily specific about whether somebody can do something versus whether there's a policy against them doing it, because nothing stops them. There's no technical controls that stop them from doing that stuff. So there's a very severe lack of communication between certain departments inside of companies, and they don't typically involve the IT or the security team until after they've already made the decisions about moving forward with different software solutions that they're purchasing. And then the last one is lack of resources. There's in any IT environment, there's always too much work and there's not enough people to do it. So those are essentially the top 6 challenges to conducting any sort of a security review. But in my mind, the biggest problem tends to be the lack of knowledge, because people don't know where to start. So let's start with that one. Where do I start? And the thing to remember with security is that security is a process. Security is not a piece of software. There's no piece of software out there that you can buy that is going to make your computer systems magically secure. And in fact, you can go so far as to say, well, I could take a hammer to the hard drive, but at that point, the system is not very usable either. So there is this balance between usability and security that you need to take into account. But the reality is that security fits in as a process into your IT environment. It's not one piece of software. It's not several pieces of software. It's about how you use those things and how you implement processes and procedures to essentially help secure your environment. So let's start with that. How do we go about building a security checklist? So the first thing to do is you essentially have to do some research. What are the best practices? And it depends a lot on the operating system, the applications that you're trying to secure and lock down. What is it that you should be doing, and how should you be doing it? So that's step 1. Step 2 is planning. How do we take that security checklist and go from a theory of how the operation should be done and how the machine should be locked down, and how do we take those into practice? And then once you've decided on what that plan is going to look like, how do you actually implement it? How do you incorporate that security checklist into your IT lifecycle management process such that those all the machines that are going into the environment go through the security checklist? And then after they're out in the field, after they are in production use or development use, or if it's a test server, if it's in the test environment, how do you make sure that all of those machines are going through this security checklist on a regular basis? So essentially, those are the three steps. It's the research, planning, and then implementation. And the first step that you have to start with is the research. What are the best practices? So let's start with that one. We're going to take a look at some of the best practices that people use to lock down machines in their environment. So essentially, where do we find these best practices? There's a lot of different companies out on the internet. If you look out there, there's various organizations. The three that I generally look to, the first one is the Center for Internet Security, and you can find them by going to cisecurity.org. They develop and distribute what are called consensus-based best practice configuration benchmarks, and they have these for various platforms. All the ones that I mentioned that I work with before, but they also work with various mobile operating systems, mainframes. You almost can name any given technology, and the Center for Internet Security generally has a best practices configuration benchmark to help lock that down. And by consensus benchmark, what a consensus benchmark is that when they decide that they're going to create a benchmark for a given operating system or platform, what they do is they get a bunch of people together. They're mostly volunteers, and they assign one person to essentially lead up the group. And it's all people who are interested in that particular technology and across a wide swath of industry verticals and industry sizes. So you might have somebody who's from an oil company that maybe it's only a couple hundred employees, and then you might have somebody else who's from a consulting company that maybe they're 10 employees, and then somebody else who's from maybe it's a security vendor, or maybe it's a software company, and maybe they're 1,000 or 10,000 employees. So you get this wide swath of experience and company sizes to help guide what this benchmark is going to look like. And what they do is they essentially decide by going through line by line. They come up with this list, which is essentially a checklist of all the things that they think are important for helping to lock down this particular platform. And then what they do is they essentially talk it out, and the process will take months. I was involved in the SQL Server 2005 policy years and years ago, and it took us probably about 4 to 5 months to nail that down, at least for the first version. It took a very, very long time. So once you get a benchmark that has been accepted by the entire committee, then it essentially gets published. It gets published out on the internet, and it becomes live for anybody on the internet to be able to use. The ISACA, which is the Information Systems Audit and Control Association, they primarily provide research and certifications and a community for the security professionals that are kind of under their umbrella. They are primarily a certification organization. They do research. They do offer materials out to people if they want to use that material to help lock down their machines. But at the same time, they are very much focused on offering security certifications to people. So they're probably a little bit less useful to most people than the Center for Internet Security in terms of the raw information that's available. But if you're looking for any sort of security certification, the ISACA is really the place to start. Looking for that, doing that search to find the certifications that would be available to you. The third place is the SANS Institute. And I like to look at the SANS Institute for their critical security controls. The SANS Institute used to publish what was called a top 20 list for the top 20 vulnerabilities over the past year that people should be paying attention to. And they updated this on a very regular basis. Once a year they'd come out and they'd say, these are the top 20 vulnerabilities across Windows and the Unix/Linux platforms that we think that people should be paying attention to. And whenever new vulnerabilities would come out, whether it was something like Heartbleed or the SQL Slammer worm, anything that came out that was a major problem for basically the technology world, they would come out and they would usually add this to their list. And at one point, it was probably back in 2007 or 2008, they started adding in mobile technologies as something that people needed to start being more and more concerned about. Since that time, they've essentially backed off of that strategy a little bit, and they've really gone over more towards a critical security controls approach. Now, with that approach, what they've done is they've essentially listed these 20 different areas that people should start paying attention to in their environment. So they've transitioned from looking at specific vulnerabilities to security controls that are in an environment. And that's a little bit more generic, but at the same time, it can be much more useful to you if you're just trying to get a handle on locking down your environment. So So basically, once you have taken a look at those three different organizations and you've started to decide what it is that you know, which organization you're going to pay attention to, whether it's one, two, or all three of them, you start taking a look at your checklist. And your checklist should essentially be a list of configuration items that you're going to go through on each of the servers that are in your environment, and you're going to use those as essentially a benchmark to look at. Now, you can go across and you can go out to the Center for Internet Security, you can download something and you can use their entire benchmark, but I'll warn you in advance, using something like that, it's several hundred pages long in most cases, and it's very difficult to go through something like that and be able to take that, translate it into something like an Excel spreadsheet, and then make it meaningful. So it's not necessarily about grabbing the data and just pulling the benchmark, it's about being able to interpret it afterwards. So if you pull, let's say, 250 different items from a machine and you start looking at them and say, this is right, this is wrong, and you end up with, let's say, 80 or 100 of them that are wrong, well, what do you do at that point? Do you start picking through them one by one? And it can be very difficult to do that. So I think a better approach is to use it as a guideline and start looking at those things and then develop your own internal policy. Now, just to show you what something like that might look like, let's say that we start our own policy, and I threw this together. I put 7 of them in here, and we might say that, okay, this is a policy going to be for Windows 7, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at this and we're going to say, okay, here's the internal ID that we're going to use. Here's the source for it, and this is a very basic spreadsheet that you can implement in your own environment, and you just give it an identifier. Where this particular control came from, what the description of it is, and then you start giving details about what the location of this particular control point is on the target machine and how do you get that and what that value should look like. So in this particular case, we go look at the registry for it and we say, okay, well, this is the registry key that we're going to look at to make sure that Service Pack 1 is installed. And then over here, what you could do is for each machine, you could just say, add in a line item that says, you know, an additional column that says, you know, for server 1, it's set to Service Pack 1. For server 2, it's the gold edition. There is not a service pack on it, etc. So you can do that fairly easily just in Excel. You don't need anything fancy to put that together. But the important piece here is really making sure that you have the controls in place. You've decided on what sorts of things you're going to look at. Again, you know, you can just kind of glance through some of these. This one says restrict the local administrators group to the following users. Antivirus software must be installed. All computers must be joined to the domain. Disk encryption will be used on all drives. Permissions to the d:/finance directory must be restricted to a particular group, et cetera, et cetera. Now, in this particular one, there's only 7 controls, but you can take a look at some of the other, you know, we could take a look at, for example, the Center for Internet Security benchmark. And if we take a look at that, what you'll see is this is 435 pages long. And as I said before, creating a security checklist is really a balance between deciding what's important to you right here and now versus what's going to, you know, probably be helpful, but isn't necessarily as important right now. If you're just starting out, you definitely do not want to throw a 400-page document at somebody and say, hey, I need you to go check these on all, you know, 500 or 1,000 of our machines. It's just not going to work. People are, you know, they're not going to do the work. And even if they do the work, it doesn't matter, because what are you going to do with that data afterwards? You really have to decide what are the minimum standards that we're going to work towards first, and then from there you put a different system in place such that you're going to move. You're going to take that baseline and say, okay, we've established this level of standard security. We're going to try and move that up a little bit. We're going to increase the number of controls from 7 to, say, 15 or 25 or something like that. So over time, your overall security posture is getting better and better, as opposed to trying to do everything all on day one, because trying that is just setting yourself up for failure. So with that said, let's take a look at once you've decided to go with something like the Center for Internet Security, how do you actually go out and get the that 400-page document so you can take a look at it and take a look at what's inside? And so again, this is all about doing the research to figure out what's going to be important in your environment. So if you go out to the Center for Internet Security website, you'll see something very similar to this. You'll see where it says Security Benchmarks is in orange. You just go down where it says Security Resources for download. Once you find that, you click on that. and you go to the next screen and you'll see another page that looks similar to this, and you'll see where it says 92 benchmark documents in PDF. That shows you all of the different benchmarks that are available for people that you can then download, and they are free to download. If you go to the next page, it says right up at the top, says download these CIS benchmarks free of charge. You click on the download CIS benchmarks here, and then there's some information that they want you to fill out. They essentially just want you to confirm whether or not you or your employer are a current CIS member. Whether would you like to participate in their consensus benchmark process? Yes or no. Would you like information about benefits of being a member? Yes or no. And you can answer no to all of these, and then down below you'll see where it says downloads, and there's a list of 92 different operating systems and platforms and applications that they have benchmarks for, and you can just simply select the ones that you're interested in. Now, once you've selected them, you scroll all the way to the bottom and you click on the the I accept. Obviously, read the terms and conditions first. You click the I accept, and then it will give you it'll ask you again, are you sure you're not interested in enrolling? You can say not now. But then after that, finally, they get to the point where they're going to give you all of the PDFs to download. And you can download them all to your hard drive and just open them up individually and take a look at them. Now, given all of that information, the one thing that comes to mind, I think, at this point is, well, having this 400-page document is great, but that's still too much information. I don't know where to go from here. So what I've done is I put together a list of what I feel is a reasonable starting point for most people. So there's essentially two different things that you want to pay attention to. The first one is that you want to have some sort of a configuration checklist. So these are things that you need to look at on all of your machines. So the first one is auditing all of the different user accounts. Take a look at all of the user accounts that are on a machine and figure out what exists, what it's used for, and are those accounts disabled or locked? And if they are, find out why. And that information should be documented someplace. So if you had an employee that was let go, that should be documented someplace, along with the fact that they have this user account here. And that's assuming that you're not going to outright delete that user account, but you can also lock it. You want to make sure that those accounts from old employees are either disabled or locked, and essentially set off to the side. You want to review them to make sure that they are still locked in the future. The second thing you want to do is you want to audit the group membership for each of those users and verify that they should be in each group. Now, it's very common in much smaller environments, as I said, to give people all permissions. It's common to have somebody as a domain administrator or a local administrator on a machine, when the reality is they really don't need that level of access. And I'll give you an example of why you wouldn't want to give somebody that level of access. I know somebody who's a penetration tester, and one of the first things he does is he looks for scheduled jobs on a machine. And as soon as he finds one, if it's run by a particular user, he'll check the permissions on the files that are being executed. And if there's no permissions there, what he can do is if the permissions are not restrictive enough, he can swap out that file and he can put a different one in that will essentially elevate his own privileges by using that as a scheduled job. And all he has to do is wait for that scheduled job to get triggered. It gets triggered. It runs under the context of that user account, which is typically an administrator account of some kind. And then it runs his own custom application, which will then elevate his privileges, and boom, he's instantly an administrator on the target machine. And that's actually a very, very easy hack to do. And most people don't realize that that's a problem. If you install any sort of application, whether it's SQL Server or a build server, for example, there's all these different applications that run in the background as processes, and if you don't have them locked down properly, it's very easy for somebody to go in and just essentially swap out an executable, add in their own, that will then go ahead and elevate privileges for somebody else in the environment. So you have to be very careful about who is an administrator on the machine and document why they're an administrator. Do they need that level of access or not? A third thing that you need to look at is password policies. How often do passwords get rotated? Are they rotated at all? Do you enforce that passwords need to be changed on that regular basis? Is there a minimum password length or complexity? All of these things are things that you definitely need to pay attention to. You do want to rotate your passwords on at least a quarterly basis and be able to verify that if you're rotating those things, nothing else in the system breaks. You want to be able to make a password change and know that something else isn't going to break as a result. When things start to break, typically it's because somebody was using their own personal account for like a a service account or something like that, and they implemented that in the environment, and then they changed their own password because they had to, or maybe somebody else found out or something like that, or just it was required on a domain controller or some other server, and then suddenly your environment breaks because they use their own personal account to run something as a service. And in Europe, for example, that's actually one of the reasons why people are forced to go on vacation. It's partly for security reasons, because when somebody goes out and goes on vacation, they lock their entire environment down for that particular user, such that if anything was in place that would do that, then they are then prevented, that those accounts are then prevented and things will start failing. So, and especially in the financial industry in Europe, it's essentially a fail-safe. And I do know somebody who works over there. He said that if he even logs in to check his email while he's on vacation, he gets a phone call from the IT security director. So, there are very good reasons for enforcing those password policies. Fourth one, firewalls. Are you making sure that firewalls are in place? And if so, what ports are you opening up in those firewalls? If a server is out on the internet, publicly available, obviously knowing which ports are available and how people are able to get into the machine is a very big deal, especially since any of those ports that are open can be leveraged by somebody to essentially do some sort of attack on the machine to try and exploit a vulnerability, or to get in, do some sort of cross-site scripting attack, something along those lines. There's a lot of different ways that ports can be exploited, but having firewalls in place will help to mitigate some of those problems. Fifth one, operating system patches, service packs. You want to make sure that those machines are up to date and you are getting those machines patched as much as possible. It's not to say that you have to patch them. Like, for example, Microsoft comes out on Patch Tuesday, or so second Tuesday of every month. You don't necessarily have to patch it that day, but rest assured that as soon as those patches come out, there are hackers around the world that are reverse engineering those patches as soon as they come out to identify what files on a system are being touched, so that they know where to start looking for where they can exploit other things. And this is why patching is such an important piece of maintaining the security of your environment, because those people are out there and they are running scripts to automatically try and break into machines on a regular basis. The sixth one is server application updates. So if you're running any sort of server application, whether it's an email server or database server or anything like that, mail server, you want to make sure that those things are up to date, and not just because it's a application on the server, but because those things are running on a regular basis. They're running for your production data, and you want to make sure that those things aren't going to be exploited. The second set of things that I put together is essentially operations processes. And these are things that you want to put processes in place for: backups, system logging and review, patching process, ongoing security reviews, and then password reset and rotation processes. These are all operational things that you're going to want to implement in your environment, more or less just to help maintain system uptime. And again, going back to the backups, you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to make sure that if a machine experiences a hardware failure of any kind or a software failure, you're able to bring it back up. Well, the same thing goes for the system login and review. You want to monitor things for login successes and login failures. If there are too many login failures, you're going to want to know about that. There are known attempts out there for people trying to brute force their way into various operating systems. And if you see too many login failures coming into a particular machine in the log, then you know that somebody's trying to get in. And this is another reason why it's so important to go and have a password policy such that you are rotating your passwords, because there will come a time where eventually they will be successful. It's probably not going to be today or tomorrow, but eventually a system will be hacked into if you're not locking those down, such that the password, the accounts are locked out or disabled if somebody tries to log in with a wrong password too many times. And most people don't implement that particular control on the administrator account or the root account, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to get into the machine if after that happened. So those are good things to be looking for, and you want to make sure that you're monitoring that. And you don't necessarily need to do it daily, but at least weekly or monthly, you want to be reviewing those logs just to make sure that the people aren't trying to get in, and if they are, you're at least aware of it. Again, patching process, ongoing security reviews, password reset, rotation processes. These are things that help you get to a reasonable starting point. It's not the only thing that you can do, but again, this is really just a starting point if you're trying to implement something new in your environment. So let's talk about a little bit about implementation. So how do you go about implementing a security checklist in your environment? And for this, there's three basic steps to it. The first one is you want to audit the machines. You want to gather up the information on each of the computers to compare against your security policies. Now, in this case, if we just have a very simple checklist, we're going to go to each of the machines. We're going to audit them. We're going to take a look at those items. We can just throw it in an Excel spreadsheet and just compare it to what the security checklist says that we're supposed to be doing. Then you want to evaluate what is currently being done on each machine, and then you want to remediate them. I don't generally, unless you only have one or two servers, I don't generally recommend doing an audit and evaluate in the same step. Doing an audit, evaluate, and remediate all in the same step on the same machine. Because if you have, say, 50 machines and you start finding that 20 or 30 of them all have the same problem, then you might want to look at different ways of making sure that it is solved on all 50 of those machines, because it can be very time consuming and expensive in terms of labor to go through and remediate those. And in fact, you have to go through and you have to review and assess them afterwards to make sure that the changes and remediation that you implemented didn't break these. Now, as part of the evaluation step, you also want to start asking questions about whether any of these machines have regressed. So it's important to, and by regressed, I mean that it used to be an acceptable value and now it's not. So part of this is not just about logging the current configuration of those machines, but it's also about taking a look at those results and saying, what did this used to be fine and now it's not? Because if that's the case, then you need to start asking questions about figuring out why it was that things were fine and then it regressed to a point that it was no longer okay. If a machine was never fixed to begin with, then that's fine. If it's a new machine that entered the environment without ever passing an internal audit, that's a question you have to ask and say, well, why didn't it pass this internal audit? Did it never go through that process? Where in your process of putting this machine into the environment did that machine slip through the cracks? So those are the types of things that you need to ask. And then again, once you get into remediation, you need to identify the machines that are misconfigured. You need to fix them. And these are the types of things that, the low-hanging fruit that malware, viruses, and bad actors like misbehaving employees or external attackers can use to exploit your environment. Those are the things that, you want to concentrate on as soon as possible, for the sole reason that you don't want those things to be exploited. So let's talk about the next steps from here. How do you go from theory to practice? And the issue here is that you really need to have some sort of IT buy-in, that IT accepts that in order to protect the environment, they need to incorporate a new process. They need to understand that implementing a security checklist is actually going to help them in the long run and prevent major problems, because the process is intended to prevent problems, not make them. And most people look at this, a security checklist, as if, oh, this is extra red tape that we have to go through. This is an extra hassle. It's a lot more work to have to do this. So really what you have to do is you have to take a step back and you have to take a look at what management has to say about this. You really need management to support this effort. If management doesn't see the value or sidesteps this process on occasion, they're going to undermine the entire effort. Let's just do this is not an acceptable excuse for sidestepping a security process. I mean, that's how major breaches happen. You have to be very careful about making sure that the management department is well informed of what the purpose of having this stuff there for is. You want to make sure that they know what are some of the consequences of skipping these processes, because if they start skipping the processes, then it's going to be very difficult to get them to buy into the fact that they always have to follow them. However, if they always follow them, and if they're always following procedures about making sure that they're not taking shortcuts about going into production with different things before they've validated it, then what you do is you dramatically cut the risks of security breaches in half, or not in half. You dramatically cut the chances of those things happening, but you also dramatically reduce the risk of downtime. So if you're deploying a new environment or a new set of servers to support an application, the downtime is a big deal, especially if it's new, because it's probably still hasn't gone under any sort of significant stress testing. So you have to be careful about those types of things. There's a lot of different tools that are out there that you can use to help enforce this your security checklist. There's Control Compliance Suite from Symantec. There's Conversant. There's Aruvio. There's SAI Global. There's SecureView from EIQ Networks. We also sell Audit Shark, which we kind of bill as the lightweight solution to this type of thing. Allows you to just fire it up and just So it looks like the audio cut out on this for a few seconds here because a window crashed. So I'm probably going to have to take it back a little bit. Let me find out where we were at, and then we'll go from there. Okay. Okay, so to start up again, essentially what we need to do is you need to make sure that when you're going from all of this theory about how you implement this in your environment, make sure that you're getting buy-in from management. Your management really has to support the effort of implementing some sort of a security checklist. So when you're trying to implement anything like this in your environment, the biggest problem is usually getting past the IT department, because this is actually best for the IT department, but it creates more work for them in some cases, so they don't want to do it. And the IT department has to accept that this is intended to protect the environment that they are tasked with supporting, and they're going to need to incorporate a new process to help them do that. They need to understand that in the long run, this is intended to help prevent major problems. It's intended to prevent those problems, not to create them. So if your management doesn't support this effort, what can happen is that somebody from management decides, oh, we need to build this new server and we don't really have time, so let's bypass process and just throw it into production. And what you've done at that point is you've bypassed the process of going through the security checklist, and you've essentially diminished the value that the business sees from this type of checklist. So when they bypass process, they undermine the entire thing, and you really need the management to accept that this is what is best for the business, and taking shortcuts is in the long term detrimental to the business. So let's just do this is not an acceptable excuse for sidestepping any of these security processes. I mean, that's how many of the major security breaches happen. If you take a look at something like Adobe Systems, for example, they had a major security breach where a build server was not validated before it went out into production, and that's exactly how those types of things happen. And they had security certificates that they had started to sign all this type of malware because somebody broke into the server because it wasn't locked down. So those are the types of things you need to be careful of. Management has to buy into whatever it is that you're doing. Now, in addition, most of these things can't be done automatically. Let's say that you have a security checklist that, remember we talked before about the Center for Internet Security has these PDFs that are 400 pages long. Well, let's say that you just have an Excel spreadsheet. It's only 25 items long, but you have 100 servers. Well, that's 2,500 data points that you're going to have to pull from the different servers that are in your environment, and it's going to be very tedious to go gather that information. It generally takes about a minute to go gather just one data point and then document it. So it's tedious to go out and gather all that information on your own. You really need to have some sort of tools in place that will go out and gather the information on your behalf, so that you don't have to have a person go do that. And it's not terribly expensive to have tools go out and gather this information. And there's a lot of different tools that you can take a look at. There's Control Compliance Suite from Symantec, there's Conversant, there's Aruvio, there's SAI Global, there's SecureView from EIQ Networks, and the one that we developed called Audit Shark. So as I said before, I want to stop here for a couple of minutes and ask people if they have any questions. And as I said, the video itself is probably a little bit ahead of where the chat is. So I'll kind of go on a little bit and I'll ask in the chat window if there are any questions that people have, so that those questions can come in while I kind of move on a little bit. Any questions? So while those questions are hopefully coming in, one thing I do want to mention and touch base on is the Audit Shark Lockdown service, it's essentially an on-demand security review service that we've developed. The idea behind the Audit Shark Lockdown service is that we'll come in, we'll help you guys create a comprehensive review of your environment and essentially perform it on your behalf. We'll take a look at the best practices from organizations like the Center for Internet Security. We'll pull back the information for you from the various machines that are on your environment, and then what we'll do is we'll essentially filter that out. So we'll pull back all the information, and then we'll act on your behalf to filter out based on what comes back to see where the major deficiencies are in your environment, and we'll interpret that for you. Because as I said before, knowledge is one of those major problems that people have an issue with because they're not necessarily knowledgeable about all the different things in the security world. So we'll essentially act as that filter on your behalf. We'll help create a process for going out and remediating things in your environment, and we'll work with you to make sure that you understand what things are important and what things aren't in your environment, because there are a lot of things in this Center for Internet Security benchmarks that are listed as, hey, you should do this, but the reality is many of them are not nearly as important as certain other ones. There's always a sliding scale of importance when it comes to security configurations. And then we'll work with you to show you the results and make sure that on an ongoing basis, you guys are able to take care of this moving forward. We could set up like a quarterly or semi-annual audit, something along those lines, to essentially help make sure that your systems are on track and things are getting better over time and not worse. So it doesn't look like there were any questions. The one question I did have that I saw from people was that how to make these security reviews as easy as possible for an IT operation so that they appreciate the value and the results. And that one, the security audits boil down to system maintenance and system uptime. So what is the cost to the business if a system is down? And that could be due to a breach of some kind, or it could be, typically it's due to operational problems. If a machine experiences a hard drive failure or something along those lines, typically the downtime is not very long because you can go to some sort of a backup. But if it's due to a security breach, you typically have to take that machine out of the environment. You can't go from a backup because the backup might be compromised as well. So at that point, you're reduced to rebuilding the server from scratch, which makes it a much lengthier process. And that's very time consuming in some cases. And you have to figure out how to get the data and make sure that the data has been scrubbed, and that nothing on the new machine is going to be broken, or that there's not compatibility problems because maybe that server has been there for 3 years or 4 years. And the software that was on it is so old that it's difficult to get those particular versions of it anymore, because sometimes there's incompatibilities between different versions of software, and that can become a major. If you have any other questions, you can reach out to me at mtaber@auditshark.com. And I think that's pretty much it.